This video will take you through my handouts for thesis and introduction. Both of those can be somewhat tricky because there are a lot of sort of guidelines and expectations when it comes to that particular part of the paper. An introduction has to do these sets of things, and there are a lot of little rules or expectations for how a thesis statement ought to be written, because the thesis statement is going to direct the reader and how sort of foreshadow the nature of the discussion that they're about to read. So it's important to be precise and clear in your writing here. So let's run through some of this thesis advice. Number one, tailor the thesis to the assignment's primary objective. Thesis largely will be dictated by the assignment handout. If you're having trouble writing that thesis statement, that's pretty reasonable, because like I said, it's an important sentence and there are a lot of things you're trying to do well when you write a thesis statement. But if you'll skip on down to number 9, it says write a crappy thesis if you need to, but change it later. If writing a thesis statement is halting your forward momentum as a writer, then just admit to yourself, you know what, this thesis statement is in essence going to say, my paper is going to be about blank. That would be a pretty terrible sentence to end the introduction with, but think of it as a placeholder. It's just, telling you yourself as you've begun to write this paper, I know what my paper is going to be about, and I know what the focus is. This isn't a pretty sentence, but it's okay. I'm going to change it later. So, number 2. But just to finish up on point number 1. If you're having trouble articulating the purpose of the paper, maybe you need to go back to your assignment handout, reread that thing, and try to find precisely what it is your instructor wants to know that you know. Because all of these papers in your first 2 years of college, each paper is a chance for you to show the instructor that you have learned the material and you can think about it and you can write clearly about it. You have ideas about it. You read it and you know it. That's basically what a discussion is in these in your freshman and sophomore years. So go back to your assignment handout and make sure you are focused and giving the instructor what it is they want out of you to see that you know. So number 2, use specific direct language to address the paper's topic. So if you happened upon a thesis statement that sounded like this one, he changed the world forever. Well, that's a pretty terrible thesis statement. We don't know who he is. We don't know how he changed the world. We don't know the world of what? The world of rhetoric or civil rights or U.S. foreign diplomacy. We have no idea. And even forever, is that a literal forever, or it's not a specific idea? So anyway, you can say it's a very confusing statement, and to read it without any context, it tells you absolutely nothing. So you need to have specific, direct language. Number 3, the thesis is placed at the end of the introduction. That's a really easy one to do correctly. And there's a reason why it should come at the end of the introduction. And a bigger one, I'd like to come back to that after we get through the rest of this. But lesson 4, writing is a process of discovery. Sometimes as you proceed through a first draft, you're gradually figuring out your own ideas. Therefore, revision is wholly necessary, especially with the paper's frames. And when I say paper's frames, I mean the beginnings and ends of things, like your introduction and your conclusion, your thesis statement. Or if we're looking at just the body paragraph, your topic sentence, which is the first sentence of a body paragraph, and the tie-in, which is the last sentence of a body paragraph. It's always a great idea to go back to all of those things and polish them and make sure they're doing what they ought to do. Given that you're, number 4, always reassess your thesis when you finish the draft, which is kind of a piece of lesson 4, right? So like I said on number 9, it's okay to write a bad thesis. Write it, move on, but you always want to think about how you wrote it, come back to it, reassess, revise. So as lesson 4 states, writing is a process of discovery. When you're doing a piece of analytical writing, oftentimes you only have hazy ideas about, let's just say, a piece of literature if you're writing an explication of Ernest Hemingway short story. You only kind of know how to interpret this thing, but then something magical happens as you begin to type and you begin to write. You begin to realize certain things, and ideas are coming at you randomly, and you're discovering what you think. Well, you finish writing your little paper, and then you go back and read the introduction, you read that thesis, and you're like, whoa, that had nothing to do with what I discovered at the end of this writing process. And that's perfectly natural, and it's an easy fix. You just go back to your thesis statement and then give a full accounting of what you realized by virtue of writing that paper. Number 5, I put stars by it because I think it's particularly helpful. You should do some writing before you actually try to sit down and write your introduction or your paper. You should do some pre-writing. Pre-writing helps tremendously with thesis writing. You need to take stock of what you know. Throw some ideas out there. Just do some low-stakes writing. It's not going to end up in the paper probably, but just get some information out there so that you're not staring into the void of a blank Word document, which some people find very crippling. So once you start having some raw material in a Word document, you can start moving things around and you start having ideas. And maybe you start realizing, oh, there's some things I don't know. Maybe this is a good time to find a source and do some research. And now you're accumulating more information. Now you have plenty of raw material from which you can build a discussion. And once you have a good fix on the discussion that's going to make, or the content that will make the cut for the discussion or paper that you're writing, now you have a way to address it in that summary fashion that your thesis statement will attempt to give. Number 6 and 7 are kind of 1 point together. Don't default to the 3-point thesis, but a good thesis can foreshadow organization or how you will classify content in the body. Sometimes students feel like they have to list in the thesis, and you don't. Sometimes listing can be useful, but let's just say you're writing a paper and you've got about 6 supporting ideas. Please tell me you're not going to list all 6 of those things in the thesis statement. No one wants to read a sentence like that, and it's really not all that helpful, is it? But if you could somehow address those 6 supporting ideas in a more summary fashion, that would be more concise and more helpful. And the reader will just trust you to know that as you progress through the body, you're going to get those other ideas that are sort of umbrellaed under that sort of half-sentence summary that exists in the latter half of your thesis. So, in short, you don't have to have a list in your thesis statement, but sometimes lists can be useful. Number 8, a thesis always makes an arguable claim, which we spoke about earlier in the previous video. It avoids ambiguities, like indefinite pronouns, empty modifiers, and abstractions. I have given examples there. The "he changed the world forever" sort of violates all of those, doesn't it? And then C, a good thesis will always assert the paper's primary objective, which we've already spoken to. Number 10 is sort of my own take on thesis statements. As a rule of thumb, I like to treat the thesis as though it could stand alone, severed from the rest of the introduction. If you deleted the rest of the paragraph, would your reader still have a definitive idea of what the paper would cover? So, he changed the world forever does not pass that test. With some context, we might know a few of those things. But without the rest of the intro, it's a pretty terrible sentence. So, to me, that doesn't pass this particular test. So I think a good, explicit thesis statement doesn't take shortcuts. It doesn't use empty words. It is very precise and specific and does all these things like make a claim, maybe foreshadows the content of the body in a helpful way. And that's just my opinion. But think of it this way. Let's just say you were writing a research paper and you had found 6 scholarly papers, and you laid them out, you printed them, and you laid them out all before you. And if the writer had done their due diligence, if they'd written their intros well and placed their thesis statements at the end of those introductions, well, you as a student writing your research paper could quickly identify a thesis in all 6 of those papers and get a clear idea of what each paper had to offer. And so you might find very quickly that, yes, I see, these 2 papers have everything to do with the focus and the discussion that I'm trying to write. I'm going to save these. And then, by reading the thesis in the other 4 and previewing those papers' content, you might say, oh, well, these have less to do, and so I'm not really going to waste my time in reading those too deeply because I think they're off topic and wouldn't prove to be all that helpful. So as you can see, I'm giving a lot of rules and guidelines to you, but I want you to trust me when I say that there are reasons behind all of these rules. And if I could take just a second to dip into English 112 territory a little deeper. These rules aren't really written down. They're kind of unspoken rules. The academic paper form is a genre unto itself, just like an email is a genre. A resume or a cover letter are genres. Well, this academic paper form that you learned in English 111 is also a genre, and genres just kind of occur naturally over time by virtue of need or purpose. So there's a real need or purpose for a resume. It's a way to quickly communicate to your potential employer your work history, your objective, your education, and your skill set. So the academic paper and the facets therein, like the thesis statement, have evolved in such a way to create expedient, understanding, efficient uptake of information. It's a way to easily communicate, a somewhat complex discussion, carefully and precisely. Well, in the illustration that I've given you, you could see where if we'd all sort of abided by this one little rule, putting the thesis last in the introduction, think about how quickly that would help a researcher identify how many of the 6 sources would be helpful in the research paper the student's trying to write. So I hope that you'll trust me throughout the rest of these sort of introductory videos, that a lot of these rules are just sort of patterns that we've discovered in the way that we like to write papers. And now that we've identified these patterns, we can use them to our benefits. We can help our readers out by placing that thesis statement last in the intro, by foreshadowing content. It makes for a much easier and clearer reading situation.